Hey everybody, Riot Mort here, and happy Wednesday. I had talked about how if the patch was off, we would react quick, and we're reacting very quick. By the time you watch this video, the patch should already be live at 2 p.m. Pacific time. So definitely making some quick changes here, but figured would be worth a rundown to explain sort of what happened and what we're changing, and yeah. So let's dive right in. Don't want this video to be too long, but let's talk about what's changing, less than 24 hours after the patch. All right, on the traits side, we mostly are focused on traits here. A couple traits ended up in the wrong spot. Fairy, we're happy that it's no longer about these unkillable Rakans. That's great, but it has left Fairy a little weaker than intended, especially at the 7 level. So we're trying to buff it up a little bit with some more health to make sure it can actually reach that 7 point. And then if you do, it's always awkward because like the Katarina, the spare Katarina that's wearing a crown isn't really going to do a ton of extra damage or anything like that. But we also want to amplify just the selfish damage that you probably are putting on like a Callista or something, so that crown at 7 is worth it more. So those are getting buffed. Honeymancer, we fixed a bug where the bees would no longer shoot repeatedly at shields. Turns out that was a very large nerf, especially when dealing with frontline, to the point where Honeymancer looks really, really bad in the data. So we're just taking this as a moment to just buff the damage dealt with Honeymancer from 5/9/16 to 6/11/18. If you think about it, 5 bees, at 5 Honeymancer, that's 55% damage amp essentially, which feels about right for a 5-piece and should be fine. Hopefully this buffs up Honeymancer a little bit. So yeah, but that bug fix definitely made a big difference. Hunter, because a bunch of stuff came down, Hunter ended up in a pretty good spot here, combined with the Tiny Jinx nerf, the Wukong late game nerf, stuff like that. So we're just reverting the Hunter 4-piece here. So Hunter 4 is going to go back to 40/70 like it was. 6 will still be really, really good. 2 is just where it was. Just a small nerf to 4 specifically. Excuse me. All right, Mage. This is the big one. Obviously, from the PBE testing I did last weekend, we were kind of expecting Mage to be too strong. It definitely ended up too strong. Some of the wildest data here. The fact that basically Vex in particular just allowed it to have way too good of an early game. Not many things could really deal with like the Soraka Seraphine Vex in the early. And then from there, you could either play the Soraka Seraphine line or you could play the Veigar Vex line. Either way, a lot of power in Vex. So we're reverting some of it, not all of it. It's not a full revert. 3-piece is still getting that buff from 75 to 85. So 3-piece should still be pretty good. Should help their early game. We saw in the previous patch, early game was really, really rough here. So don't want to mess with that. But as it scales into the late game, the 5 and the 7, that's going to come down quite a bit. So 5 is going back from 100 to 95. Remember, it was at 90. So still a buff. And 7 especially, this is the one where it felt like it got real out of control. It goes from 125 to 115. It was 110 before, so still 5 up. It is still a buff from the previous patch, but definitely not as big a buff as we should have done. So, all right, Multi-Striker. The 3-piece nerf we're happy with. I know it changes some lines, like the Fairy line. That is intentional. The 3-piece is already really, really insane. But it has left Multi-Striker vertical in a pretty rough spot. So trying to help the 5 and the 7 if you want to go vertical Multi-Striker. My read is this isn't going to like massively shift things, but it should help it a bit if you're actually going that vertical line. Try to help it out. Portal's in a really weird spot. Portal is this crazy tempo summon trait that if you get an emblem and you activate it early, right? 6 portal on 3/2, 8 portal on like 4/1, 4/2. It is really tough to beat because you get like those Krugs with really high health. You get those bombs doing big flat damage. That's really hard to beat. And then you usually end up in like a second, maybe a third. So, it had some of those scaling problems. We addressed some of those scaling problems with the patch, with the banner and the Poro snacks, but that has left the mid game and that tempo play stronger than we'd like. There aren't a ton of great levers here, so we are going to nerf the bomb damage. That way the bombs don't hit as hard in the mid game. My guess is Portal's still going to be kind of where it is. There aren't a ton of great levers here, but that's what we're going to go with. Preserver basically paid the price for Fairy and Arcana. Those were kind of the big late game things that were dominating last patch. Preserver was good, but it wasn't oppressive by itself. It just sort of supplemented other lines. This has left the actual preservers and the preserver line, the preserver augments, kind of in a rough spot. So giving preserver, we're just reverting it. So preserver will go back to the way it was before. Pyro, 50 and 55, 50 and 65 here should be green. We are buffing the 4 and the 5 piece. The vertical just hasn't been as good as we want, especially now that Varus is right where we want him. Varus feels pretty good. We're going to buff the vertical Pyro, so this should help Pyro Emblem, Akali, stuff like that. So Pyro vertical should be good. And then Vanguard. Vanguard's in a weird spot where the vertical is mostly played around like Warwick and hero augments. So that being said, those are too strong right now. So this buff ended up being too much. So we're reverting this part of the buff. The 4 Vanguard buff will stay. So they still got that 4 Vanguard buff from the previous patch, but the 6 piece is being reverted down to 15% DR. All right, so hopefully that puts the traits in a better spot. On the champion side, Namzi combined with the Shapeshifter buffs put Shapeshifter Dragon into way too good a spot. So Namzi in particular, she'll still keep that +2 AD she got, just losing the 555% from the Dragon spell AD. The Dragon buff ended up being really good, leaving that there. Vex, the other part of the mage equation, we buffed the 1 and 2 star, which we really shouldn't have. Combined with the mage buff ended up being too much. Vex's cap was always good. So the reality is we probably should have nerfed Vex at 7 with Vex 3 instead of just leaving her alone, and kind of left the early game alone. So that's what we did. If you compare this to the previous patch now, 1 star is the same, which means it's a buff because mage has been buffed. 2 star has been nerfed a little bit, which means it should be neutral to the previous patch. And 3 star has been nerfed, which means it should be, again, pretty close to neutral there. So early game mages, still stronger than 14-19, much less strong than they are right now, and hopefully actually killable in the early game. Puts Vex in a better spot. Fiora, warriors suffered from the loss of DR of their trait. The Fiora nerf felt like overkill and the easiest one to revert, so we just reverted that. And then Callista paying for the crimes of Queen Guard's armor. Callista does a lot of damage, and that's what she does, but mostly because she had an immortal god tanking for her. Now that Rakan's not as immortal, Callista's not really finding her spot. Combine that with the fact that she's never really found her spot in Multi-Striker, so we're going to buff her spear AD ratio, allowing her to sync better with AD items, as well as just frankly do a little bit more damage, and possibly you'll see a Multi-Striker AD line. Fairy lines help. Again, it needs it right now, and she does need the buff to compensate for the fairy nerfs that she had before. All right, one last thing. Again, not too big a patch, but a couple things here. Spin to win with that bug fix from 14-19 ended up way too good. Combine that with the fact that like hunters are in a good spot and things like that. This augment ended up being too good. We're pretty happy that like when you get it, he's tanky and that's cool. Doesn't change anything. But he scales up really, really fast. 20 AD and 30% attack speed per cast ends up being pretty insane. So we are hitting that pretty hard to try to get that augment back down. It's a 12% and 20%. So there you go. Like I said, obviously we'll monitor from here. But again, promised you that we would act really, really quick. That was the goal, so that, you know, it's not in a bad spot for very long. And for some of our competitor players who are probably getting ready for regionals, this should maximize your time to practice the patch as it is. The odds of another patch from here are very, very low. I would not expect another one here unless something goes horribly, horribly wrong, which it shouldn't. This is all safe reverts and stuff like that. But there you go. There's the patch. Again, should be live by the time you're already watching this. I'm posting the video after it's scheduled to go live. So, yeah. All right. That's going to do it for me. Until next time, take it easy.